My name is Gary Dennis. Good day, everyone who's watching this YouTube today. Our topic is talking about Baysville and McLean Township, which is east of Bracebridge, for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with the area. I have a map here that I'm going to hold up and show you the areas that we will be talking about today. This is kind of central McLean Township. The area where my finger is now is Baysville, and I'm going to be talking about some people who moved in to the area, and they're up here in this corner. So they weren't in Baysville, but they were over here. So that's just where I am. That would be northeast of today's village, and that would be in an area that, if you're familiar with the Baysville zone and you're traveling up the Brunel Road, you will come to a road on your left, and it's called Langford Road, and that's where that property was that I was just showing you. McLean Township's basic land survey, which is basically what that map was finished in 1862, and the public land surveyor who did the work was a man by the name of R. Burns. He reported, now get this, that the township had favorable soil for farming and a number of sites for constructing sawmills or grist mills along the south branch of the Muskoka River, because it crossed the township diagonally from northeast to southwest out of the Lake of Bays. Well, we can certainly agree that there was a site for a sawmill or whatever kind of mill at Baysville right there, but I don't think McLean Township is terribly well known for its agricultural pursuits. Anyway, that's what land surveyors said. Of course, they were looking at the landscape with all the trees that had never been cut, and so everything was just all there, and they were just maybe making predictions, but their predictions were based on things that they didn't know about, and so we're not criticizing them, we're just saying that's what they may have thought. This flat land was great, but maybe it was not so great. Although the townships in Muskoka were pretty well surveyed to include 14 concessions with 35 lots of 100 acres each in size, when McLean Township was surveyed, it only had 13 concessions, and each one had 32 lots. And the lots were, in general, 100 acres, which isn't unusual. But of course, there were lots of exceptions due to the rivers and the lakes. And the other thing that's kind of different about McLean Township, when all the other surveys, not all of them, but almost all the other surveys in Muskoka in the townships, the lots were numbered from west to east. So lot 1 would be on the west side, lot 32 or 5 or whatever would be on the east side. McLean Township was totally the different way around. The high number lots were on the west side, the low number lots were on the east side. Not that it mattered, it doesn't matter. It's just, I don't know why that would have been done. I've never been able to find out. Maybe he just wanted a little variety in his work that day. Well, how did it get its name? Well, I'm going to show you the gentleman for whom the township was named. And you can see he's a very distinctive looking gentleman. And he had a very distinctive name. He had a very distinctive job as well. He was the Chief Justice of Upper Canada, and his name was Archiebald Mclean. He was born in 1791, and he died in 1865. And with a name like Mclean, I imagine you could well imagine he was a Scottish immigrant. He had come to Canada, and he fought in the War of 1812 as part of the 2nd Regiment of the York Militia. And he was very very seriously injured at the Battle of Queenston Heights in the Niagara Peninsula. Well, he recuperated from his injuries and he rejoined his regiment, and he helped fight off the Americans at the battle in Lundy's Lane, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and the story about Laura Secord and all that. However, Mr. McLean had a misfortune and he got captured by the Americans, and he became their prisoner of war and remained as a prisoner of war until the war ended in 1814. Evidently, the military wasn't a great career for Archiebald Mclean. So he completed his education and he became a lawyer in Cornwall, Ontario in 1815. So that was pretty good to be able to complete your education a year after you came out of the military, so he must have been pretty smart. He began to get interested in the political discussions of the day and decided to seek a seat for the Conservatives in the Legislative Assembly for the county of Stormont. He was successful, and from 1820 until 1834, he was elected for a 2-year term as the Speaker of the House. Now you remember, Ontario was not a province yet. We're still talking Upper Canada, and I believe at that time the capital of Upper Canada was in Kingston, so he was in his home territory. Mr. McLean, being Scottish, we're not surprised to learn that he would be a strong and aggressive advocate for having the Presbyterian Church be equal to the Church of England or Anglican in political decisions. And if you know your Canadian history, you'll know that the Anglican Church was more or less dominant and were given favors, and Mr. McLean didn't appreciate that. By the way, Mr. McLean never did see McLean Township. He was never here. This just wasn't a possibility for him. But anyway, because of all his good things that he did, he got a township named for him. In 1837, Archiebald Mclean became a judge, and I found some words of what some people said about him. Quoting, "On the bench, dignified and courteous, unsuspicious and utterly devoid of anything mean or petty in his own character. His conduct to others was always what he expected from them." Such was the man for whom McLean Township was named. So, let's find out now when somebody came to McLean Township who was non-Indigenous and who explored the township for the first time. And remember, I'm saying he was non-Indigenous. He was not a native. So that person was also a very good-looking young gentleman, and his name was Alexander Murray. Many of the lakes and streams in Muskoka and Algonquin Park were given their names by this unique gentleman. As I said, his name was Alexander Murray. He had a very duplicitous life, actually, because his life was kind of divided into two separate periods. And neither one was bad, but that's how his life ended up, according to what he did. He was very active in his working days, and the events of in his personal life almost equally between two countries. His services to mapping the topography and geology of Canada happened from 1842 to 1864. So that was very important work for this gentleman. And then, where the second part of his life comes in, he went to the island of Newfoundland remember, Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada at this time because it didn't become part of Canada in 1949. So in essence, Newfoundland was another country run and operated by Britain at the time. And he stayed there from 1864 to 1883. So he was very foundational in the development of both Muskoka and a great deal of Newfoundland. Kind of interesting that we have that in common. I never even knew all this before I got into this young man. His life began and ended actually in a village called Crieff in Perthshire, Scotland. He was born there in 1810 and he died there when he was 74. Murray was educated at the Royal Naval College in Portsmouth, England, after which he entered into the Navy. And he entered the Navy in 1824. If you recall when he was born in 1810. So he went into the Navy when he was 14 years old. And he went in as a midshipman. And although he only remained in the naval service for 10 years, he was fond of the seagoing atmosphere. And he liked the nautical terminology that was used before and aft and starboard and all of those things. And he also liked one other thing. He liked the language of the naval officers. Now, you know you've heard stories about the language of a sailor. Well, it's a little colorful. So anyway, Mr. Murray grew up, and I guess he kind of absorbed a lot of that, and you'll find out later on when we get into the story. So these peculiarities stood him in good stead, especially when he moved to Newfoundland. Well, Murray was a man of medium height, had a fair complexion, blue eyes, flaxen beard, and very powerful muscles that he had developed on all his work on board the ship for 10 years, remember. Unfortunately, with all that behind him and all that work, at the age of 40, in 1850, he had a paralytic stroke, and it severely curtailed the feats of strength in which he had formerly boasted and delighted. But this malady did not deter him from taking on rigorous tasks that required a deep spirit of resolve and a great deal of tenacity. Now, he had a very interesting habit. He loved a frigidly cold bath every morning. And he regarded a cold bath every morning as essential as prayer. Now remember, he was a very strong Presbyterian, and he certainly believed in prayer. Well, he must have really believed in these cold water baths because he even thought they were more important than his prayers. And even if you were out working with him, and you were exploring with him, and you were part of his party, no matter how bad the weather was, it didn't matter if it was snowing, sleeting, raining, whatever the wind could be blowing, no matter how inconvenient the tent was, or from where there was a little pond or a body of water or a lake or a river, and how much brush he had to crawl through to get to it, he always made it sure when he got up in the morning, the first thing he did before breakfast, he'd make his way to the water and he'd climb in that cold water. Cleanliness was sort of a hobby with him, and he had a very poor opinion of anybody else who did not tub with regularity. Well, I'm sure those people didn't want to follow him into the cold water. In matters of belief, Murray was a Presbyterian, as I told you, and he had led a very straightforward life. And he detested anybody who was a hypocrite and anybody who was on that line. Now, among women, he was very gentle, he was very affable, and he was quite polished in his manners and conversation. And he loved children. He was very kind to poor people, and he was considerate and sympathetic to those who were sick. He tended to be very outspoken, especially in the presence of men, and of course, this is when his sailor's language would come to the fore, because he had the language of a sailor, and he made sure that he used it around when he was having conversations with men. Well, this was the man who well, I guess we could say was the first white person who discovered McLean and where Baysville is located today. Now, Alexander got married. He married a lady by the name of Fanny Judkins in Liverpool, England, and they had 3 children, Mary and Anthony and Helen. And they were born, one was born in Woodstock, then the second one was born in Scotland, and the third one was born back in Woodstock. And that's where they made their home. And that's where his wife died in 1862. Now, after being a widower for 6 years, Alexander found another lady that he fell in love with, and her name was Elizabeth Cummins, and he married her in January 1868. And remember I said he loved children. Well, he had 5 more of them with this lady. And he had another daughter named Mary Isabella, and another one called Frances. Then there was William, then there was Alice, and then there was Alexander. And Alexander was the last one born into his family, and he was born in 1876. Now in 1842, the Geological Society of Canada was instituted by a man named Sir William Logan, and he was the chief geologist. Now, Murray and Logan met a year later, and it appears that Alexander was hired as the assistant provincial geologist, which was a pretty important job at this in any era, but especially then in this period of exploring the hinterland of Ontario, anything north of what they called the front, all the counties along Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Because remember, the government eventually got to the point where there was enough of a population in the southern part of Upper Canada or Ontario that they were going to move up north, and of course that included Muskoka. Apparently, Murray had had some practical training in geology when he was in the Navy, so that stood him in good stead, and he had learned about topographical surveying while acquiring his nautical education in Portsmouth. So he had a skill set that was just ready to be used in this new important job. So one day he went into the office in 1853, and Logan said to Murray, "I have a job for you, and here's your task. I want you to do an extensive survey of all the unexplored territory between Lake Huron and the Ottawa River." Now, if you take a look at the map of Ontario, and you see all that territory from the shore of Lake Huron across the Ottawa River, you know that's not a minor assignment. Obviously, he was unacquainted with that area because no non-native person had ever been there, other than the very odd few who went through in canoes. So he prepared conscientiously. He took extra provisions, he took a second canoe, and he took up 2 fellows with him as backup people for the assignment. And in total, there were 7 men and 3 canoes on this very lengthy expedition. This was Murray's cup of tea. As they say, he loved life in the bush, he was an expert canoeist, and he loved the freedom of the woods and the water. In addition to his other qualities, he was a great sportsman, and he loved guns, fishing rods, and dogs. He was a consummate man, apparently. His specialty was fly fishing. He considered it to be the grandest sport in the world. So step aside those kings who believe horse racing is. This he considered was the greatest sport in the world. Murray, apparently, being a fairly staid gentleman most of the time, if you were out with him fly fishing and he caught a big trout on his fly hook, he absolutely went berserk. He just went all over the place. He laughed and shouted, threw his arms in the air, and people who thought differently of him were kind of shocked that he would be this kind of person. I guess he's like some of those quiet men who go to a football game or a hockey game and they become quite animated, so maybe he was one of those. It all began when he selected the river route. It all began as far as McLean Township was concerned, I should have said, a route from Lake Huron, and he was able to find his way, and I think this is quite a miraculous thing, for 22 miles up into Lake Muskoka. So he found his way from Georgian Bay up the rivers through what would be now Bala, and then up through and into the lakes, and found the mouth of the Muskoka River down beyond Santa's village, and then he was made his way up, and he finally got to Bracebridge. Now, as you know, at Bracebridge, it's called the Forks. It's where the north and the south branch come together, just there by the Quality Inn Hotel. And he was there, and in his logbook, he indicated that he thought that the south branch of the Muskoka River would be the main one. So why didn't he go up that branch? He went up the other one instead. So he went to Bracebridge Falls and Wilson's Falls, and then High Falls and Duck Chute into Mary Lake, and he did all of that kind of stuff. And the survey party arrived at a series of these very picturesque lakes, and when he came up, he found he got into this body of water, and remember, he had a daughter named Mary, and so the lake he was in, he called Mary's Lake. And so that's how Mary's Lake got its name at Port Sydney. The next lake they encountered, he named Fairy Lake. I can't find out why. From which they traveled in a generally northeastern angle, and after working their way through a narrow marshy area at the east end of Fairy Lake, they explored the next body of water, and due to its shape, decided to call it Peninsula Lake. Well, he checked out the south shore of Peninsula Lake, and he soon realized that there was a third body of water over which he could reach on a short portage over the height of land. And after doing so, they canoed across a long, narrow, stretching away southward for several miles, a large lake that he called the Lake of Bays. Now, just as a point of reference, where he crossed from Peninsula Lake over into the Lake of Bays was in 1900, where the shortest working railroad in the world was built, called the Portage Railway, and it was over that portage, that little narrow spit of land that was there. It was noted that the south branch likely connected to the from Lake of Bays to Muskoka Lake. So right now, we're talking about the history of Baysville. This is the man who was standing maybe where the bridge is or where the dam is, in downtown Baysville, if you will, and that's where he explored. And he said, and he wrote in his notes, "This must be a very rapid or broken up river by heavy falls," as he learned, and he had kept notes, that the difference between where he was in Baysville down to Muskoka Lake was a difference of 323 feet. At this juncture, Alexander Murray decided to proceed in a different direction that led him into Oxtongue Lake, Canoe Lake, and on to Petawawa, and then eventually to the Ottawa River. His mission was accomplished, and his progress report was published in a government publication under the authority of the Governor General of British North America, Sir Walter Head. Well, there is the first white person who saw as far as we know, where Baysville is today. So that gives you some background history as to why it's called McLean, who saw this and realized the potential for something to happen at Baysville. I think he had that in his mind. Now, the townships through which the Muskoka colonization road passed were, in general, settled first for the sake of convenience, of course. People call it the main street of Muskoka, and so the townships on either side, normally, it was the line of least resistance. So when you got to Severn Bridge and you started north towards what became Gravenhurst, it was natural that settlement would happen on either side of the road and then move back accordingly as more settlers came in. And that happened all the way from Bracebridge right up through central Muskoka. What was left out, of course, were the townships that were one step back from that. So when you got to Bracebridge, then Bracebridge was here, and McLean Township was to the east of that. So Macaulay got settled, but there weren't very many people were making their way over to McLean Township. So as we said, it got surveyed in 1862, and then of course the date of 1868 is when out came the free grant land, and that's when people started to take a more active interest in coming to Muskoka. So if you know anything about the history of Baysville, you know that the big name is William H. Brown, and rightly so. The man on which much of Baysville is located and was originally granted was to him. He was a sawyer who worked in a sawmill from Burford, Ontario, near Brantford, and he arrived in June 1871. Now, in exchange for additional land, he got the water rights at the falls, and he promised the government, under the agreement of the Free Grant Act, that he would build a lumber mill. And Mr. Brown realized this was a great spot. This was going to be a great spot to have a settlement. And so he filed two subdivision plans, one in 1873 and another in 1875. I'm always amused when I go to Baysville and I see that one of the streets was named either University Avenue or University Street. I don't know. I thought Mr. Brown had high hopes. Maybe not. I don't know. But it always makes me laugh. I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying I always think it's rather humorous. His vision proved right, though. The population grew, giving rise to a post office where he was postmaster from 1874 to 1920. I'm going to show you a picture of Mr. Brown when he was fairly young. He was a pretty good-looking guy. He had a receding hairline, but that's okay. Some of us are subject, but you noticed he had a lovely bushy beard down here, so we forgive him, don't we? He gave land for the three churches that eventually got into Baysville, as well as a school. He gave lots away to his friends, and so that was something that Mr. Brown did. I'm just going to do my last few moments and talk to you not about Mr. Brown, but about a man who came to McLean before Mr. Brown. And this man, his name was Thomas Langford, and he had connections to Muskoka through his sister Elizabeth, who settled just east of Bracebridge at a little place called Macaulay Center, where I actually live, and he could hear the sound of High Falls from his house. That's how close he was to High Falls. So just a little bit up Muskoka Road 118 toward Baysville, just around the corner a little bit from Forster Trail. Where you get to Forster Trail, just down and around that corner a little bit. And that's where Mr. and Mrs. Isaac and Elizabeth Langford lived. Elizabeth was Tom Langford's sister, and she had been the one who had encouraged him to come to Muskoka, which he took seriously, and he brought two of his sons with him, and they made their way to Muskoka. Now, Mark Langford made a comment in one of his writings, he said, Muskoka was at the time advertised as a very El Dorado. In other words, it was a pretty nice place to go. So it was on May the 1st, 1870, when Tom Langford and his son and 3 friends, and another son, by the way, all came up from Perth County with the idea of locating homesteads in McLean Township. And that was fine. That was a good idea. Unfortunately, when they got to Bracebridge, Mark's father, Tom, fell ill. He didn't enjoy really good health anyway, because as a younger man, he had fallen and in a sawmill, and he had been fairly severely injured. And when he got there, I guess, it took them 6 days, by the way, to travel up from where they lived. And of course, we weren't traveling by first class gray coach or Hammond's transportation bus. We were on a horse and wagon, and so it would be tough. And so he got there and he took a turn for the worse. So Mark and his brother and 3 of these friends, they made their way out towards McLean Township. Now, in those days, you would have gone along the river up to Wilson's Falls, and there was a bridge across there, and then you would have made your way up and ended up crossing over where the bridge is at number 11 Highway now, and then getting that, coming out about Cedar Lane, and then you'd cross there, and of course all of that wasn't there naturally, and then he kept on going, and the first place he would come to would be Macaulay Center. So he would pass where his sister lived. And then he kept going, and he would come to a little place called Stoneleigh. And there were some Scottish people settled there, and so then he would keep going, and this road had been kind of created through what they call the Devil's Gap, and it was a rock cut. Tough, terribly hard to get through, and they had actually tried to make a board road up through, or a board drive up through this. And then when he finally got into McLean Township, he passed the border between McLean Township and Macaulay, he realized that they came to 3 little shelters, 3 little shanties, and they realized that they weren't the first in McLean Township, but there was a little settlement there. And eventually it got to be called Cripplegate. And that's named after a community in England. No one much has ever heard of Cripplegate, but it was there. Well, from there, it was going to be at least another 4 miles to the lot for which Tom Langford had agreed to settle on. Well, when Mark and his brother and the 3 friends got a look at what they faced after they were in this little settlement with the 3 shanties, it was basically just the survey line, and it was a disaster. And so they all got together and they decided they're going to quit. They weren't going to do this. They were going to go back to Bracebridge. And so in the meantime, when they got back to Bracebridge, they found out that Tom Langford got tired of waiting for them, so he had gone home. And so then when Mark got back to Bracebridge, he wrote a letter to his father, and he said, "Father, this is not a possibility. We are quitting. We're not going to do this. We're going to find somewhere else." So he waited a few days. The letter came back to Bracebridge, and Mark's father said, "No way. We are not quitting. If you're not going to go in there, I'll hire somebody else to do it." And so 17-year-old Mark should have known that his Irish father had a lot of determination. Well, they went back, they set up some shanties, and they cut stuff, followed the survey line all winter, and they cut out an area to make a road. And Tom surprised them in March 1871. The boys went back to Bracebridge to get supplies, and who was there? Tom, his wife, and the 10 kids that were his brothers and sisters. Duh! Now what? The road wasn't even close to being ready. There was just nothing. And of course, they didn't just come with themselves. There were their clothes, their stove, their furniture. They'd hired somebody else. Tom had hired somebody else to come with him. And so he said, we're going, we're going, we're going. And away they went. And of course, they could only go as far as what became Cripplegate. And that's where it all. And of course, you got to remember, this was March. And it'd take them 6 days to get there. And of course, Tom was thinking this road's going to be open. We're going to be able to take all our stuff in here. But he didn't have any idea what the conditions were like in Muskoka. He came from southern Ontario, and in March of 1871, there was still 4 feet of snow on the ground. Well, I'm not stopping for that, Mark said, in his Irish accent. I'll be getting myself a team of oxen and I'll be going out there. Don't you worry about it. Facing Begor, I'll be getting there no matter what. And so he hired a team of oxen, and they took them and they plodded them out, and they got to Cripplegate, where Mr. Hussey was the man who lived there, and 2 other friends, and they started to go down this trail, and of course the oxen just bogged right down. They couldn't do this, and so Tom had to give up. The oxen took them back to Bracebridge, or had them taken back to Bracebridge. So he said, all right, boys, if we can't do it with the oxen and we can't do it with horses, we're going to do it with you. And he made them do a footpath, tramp down the snow in this 3 to 4 feet of snow. And so tramp down this snow, and finally they were able to start to take their stuff, 1 load at a time, on a hand sleigh, pulled by hand. And of course, Mr. Langford couldn't help because he was crippled. They called him Crippled Tom, and he was. And so, guess who did the work? Well, remember, he started with 3 friends, 2 sons and 3 friends. One of the friends quit totally. He settled in Draper Township. The other 2 stuck it out. And so the 2 older boys and these 2 friends, they got their stuff in to these lots northeast of what would become Baysville. And it wasn't until 1873 that the government sanctioned that they cut the road through to Baysville, take down the trees, haul out the stumps, and get that ready, because they knew there was going to be a lot of people coming into this area. And this is how the village of Baysville then began to develop. They built a bridge over the river in 1873. And in the days before that, they'd had a cedar raft that they'd used to cross the river. But you must remember, the river's fairly swift there. And because of the falls, the dam wasn't there naturally. And so, unfortunately, there was a son and his father went down the falls and drowned. And that's when Mr. Brown gave something else to the village of Baysville. He donated land for the first cemetery. And that young man and his father are there. They were buried there in 1872. Well, I'm just about done. But in 1874, McLean got municipal government and a post office. And there was the opening of a school. And the churches started to come. And the one thing that I have always found interesting about the community of Baysville, in 1891, and remember, Baysville was a small community. We had Bracebridge and we had Gravenhurst and Huntsville, and we're not surprised that they had nice libraries. Well, in 1891, the citizens, especially one citizen of Baysville, felt the need to establish a public library. And a public library was established in the community of Baysville, which is still in operation in the back end of their arena, their community center complex, which will be something similar to what we're going to have in Bracebridge. And I'm sitting doing this in the library here with Sarah, who's nodding at me and saying, yes, we're going to be glad to do this. And so Baysville wasn't ahead of Bracebridge in getting a library, but they certainly were ahead of a lot of smaller communities. So I will just finish with this comment. I've known Baysville all my life. I went to high school with all the kids on the bus from Baysville, and I've always had a lot of respect for Baysville, and we still enjoy going there. And I just want to show you one more picture as I close. This one I had in my postcard collection, and it shows you the river, and it's hard to see, but the bridge is there as well, the iron bridge that they eventually built. Now, I remember the iron bridge, and some people who are watching this today will probably remember that as well. Thank you for your time and your interest. I hope I gave you something worthwhile to think about from the history of Baysville. And I wish you well with your 150th anniversary celebrations. I think you're going to do a great job, and I hope we'll be able to come and visit you without having to stand 6 feet away from each other. Well, time will tell. Thank you.